place they found themselves in. So putting forward this theory, geographic distribution of species, he said, or he implied that the creation account of creating different species all around the world at the same moment does not hold. That was his point. Now let's go through some of his quotes very quickly. Here's what he said. He said, the view of each species having been produced in one area alone and having subsequently migrated from the area as far as the powers of migration and subsistence and the powers of present conditions permitted is the most probable. So he said, look, they all must have started in the same place and then migrated. Such cases, I quote, continuing, such cases as the presence of peculiar species of bats on oceanic islands or the absence of all of the terrestrial mammals are facts utterly inexplicable on the theory of independent actual creation. The fact that you find, only bats in a certain place, you don't find other things, disprove the fact that God created everything in all places at the same time. He continues, he who admits the doctrine of the creation of each separate species will have to admit that a sufficient number of the beasts, best adapted plants and animals, were not created for oceanic islands, for man has stopped them far more fully than in nature. So why, may we ask, has the supposed creative force produced bats and no mammals on remote islands? So he's trying to explain, why can't we find some things and not everything there? On my view, this question can easily be answered. For no terrestrial mammal can be transported across a wide space of sea, but bats can fly across. So he says, because they have the capability to migrate, that's why you see this. So coming back, he says, this proves the creation doctrine, the creation account that we see. So, according to geographic distribution, there could be only two ways for animals or species to move from one location around the world. It's either through migration or because of widespread population being dislocated due to climate or geological changes. But what do we actually find? Here's what we find, and here are just two examples. That the world, there are many cases of geographic distribution for which neither the center of origin followed by migration or the widespread distribution because of fragmented barriers can explain. Here are two examples. The worldwide distribution of flightless birds or reptiles. You have the ostriches in Africa, the rheas in South America, the emus in Australia, and the kiwis in New Zealand. 2 points to know. These are flightless birds, so they could not have migrated. Second point, these birds are recent birds. They did not exist prior to what is known as the continental drift. So they could not have been dislocated and transposed or translated to different parts of the world because of a continental drift. Second example, freshwater crabs. And this was studied intensely by an Italian biologist in the 1920s. Freshwater crabs complete their entire life cycle exclusively in freshwater habitat. They cannot survive in salt water. Now what do we find? We find very similar species in lakes and rivers in Central and South America, in Africa and Madagascar, in Southern Europe, in India, Asia and Australia. And molecular evidence indicates that these animals originated once again after the continents separated, therefore contradicting distribution due to geological dislocation. So once again, the facts contradict his proposed theory. So instead of providing sufficient evidence to support his view, Darwin simply dismissed creation on the grounds that it is not a scientific explanation. A second area that we must examine is his use of fossils. Of course, Darwin collected fossils. Other fossils were sent to him by researchers in other parts of the world, and he examined them, studied them, and then he proposed that the fact that you find fossils, that all these fossils really indicate a gradual evolution with many different species in between. And the fossils can be arranged in a sequence to reveal to us the descent of man through natural selection. The interesting thing that to keep in mind in Darwin's theory is this, that there is a period known as the Cambrian period, geological, the Cambrian period. All the fossils that have been found have come since the Cambrian period, which is the geological Cambrian period. It is also known as the Cambrian explosion because there is this huge volume of fossils that all date back to time after the Cambrian period. So Darwin attempted to explain away the fact that we could not find huge fossils prior to this time by saying that during this time there existed species and lower life forms that could not endure being held in fossil form and could not endure erosion and degradation over time. He said that the pre-Cambrian organisms were too small or too soft to have fossilized in the first place. That was his idea, to exclude the reason, to avoid, to explain the reason why there were no fossils before the Cambrian period. Here are some of his quotes. Darwin says, the great facts in paleontology, study of fossils, agree admirably with the theory of descent with modification through variation and selection. He said, based on this theory, we can understand why the more ancient a form is, the more it generally differs from those living now. So if you find a fossil that's really old, you can assume it's going to be very different from what you see now. And why ancient and distinct forms often tend to fill up gaps between existing forms. But such facts, he argued, are wholly inexplicable on any other view, such as the view that each layer of fossil marks a new and complete act of creation. So he says, these different fossils do not represent separate acts of creation, but they actually are in an endless chain. By the theory of natural selection, he wrote that all living species have been connected with the parent species of each genus by differences not greater than we see between the natural and domestic variations of the same species at the present time. So there has to be a link behind each, and the difference should be as minimal as we see between a natural and a domesticated version of an animal. That's the only difference we should see. So he says, thus in the past, the number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great. But here's the problem. The American paleobiologist William Stoffel wrote in 1994, here's what he says, the long-held notion that pre-Cambrian organisms must have been too small or too delicate to have been preserved in geological materials is now recognized as incorrect. So, if there were pre-Cambrian animals, species, the assumption that they were not kept in fossilized form is incorrect. If they existed, they should remain. According to the Berkeley paleontologist James Valentine, he said the explosion is real. That is the Cambrian explosion of finding so many fossils around the same period. It is too big to be masked by flaws in the fossil record. So it turns out that the problem of the fossil record is not that so many transitional forms are missing, but that fossils cannot provide evidence for descent with modification.